Hey everyone, you probably heard that there's a global pandemic going on, so we are working from home for a while. But we're still going to break down devs. We're going to talk about episode 4 this week. There's spoilers ahead, of course, and please subscribe to GameSpot Universe if you enjoy our videos.
So the intro of this episode is so scary. There are these shots of Forrest and Katie in this really stark lighting and a dead rat, and I don't know what's going on with this.
There's no narrative reason for it, but it's visually jarring to see like bright red, bright green, bright blue, like up in your face, and it puts these characters like literally in a new light. And so I think it's hard to pinpoint why that's like weirdly terrifying.
Yeah.
But it is.
It's extreme.
It is.
And especially with like the how stark it is in the gold room. Like everything has been so like metallic, and then you have this like red and green. It's just, it makes me so uncomfortable.
So what about the rat? What do you think?
The rat is really interesting to me. I think it's just because I've been researching so much about, like pilot waves and quantum theory for this show that like the idea of like Schrodinger's cat is so much in the forefront of my mind. So like that was the first thing I thought of when like seeing a dead animal in this context. It was like, oh, is this like their like Schrodinger's animal? Like, are they trying to like resurrect this dead rat? I don't know. What about you?
So the Schrodinger's cat is the idea that if there's it's like a quantum thing where if there's a cat in a box, it's both dead and alive until you look at it and it confirm its state, essentially, which I don't think Forrest would agree with that. Like that's contrary to Forrest's entire deterministic tramlines thing, where like the cat is either dead or alive, and you looking at it or not looking at it is not going to change that. There's nothing you can do to make the cat be in a different state. It's not, there's not he said it in episode 1, and it relates to this episode as well. There's not multiple time. He doesn't like multiple worlds. He doesn't like multiple timelines. There's one thing. There's one branch. There was a Reddit comment on the thread for this episode from user Up Down Karma. Their interpretation is that the rat managed to get inside the devs complex, and it's a signal that Forrest isn't omniscient. It's like a contaminant inside of his like
like
perfect,
a fly in the ointment.
Clinically sealed. A fly in the ointment. Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
I don't know.
That's interesting.
It's a rat.
Yeah, it's definitely a rat. It's like a super dead rat too. Like it's not even just like a little bit dead. Like it's like mummified.
Does it look burned up? Like does it relate to like Sergei's body maybe?
I didn't think it looked burned, but it's hard to tell. Like I thought it looked just like extremely dried out. But I mean, I think I don't know. Like with the Schrodinger's cat thing, like I think in the context of a deterministic world, like I mean, it's obviously not the idea as literally prescribed. Like, it's not like the idea that it's both, it's two things at once until you look at it. But it wouldn't, in the idea of, like, the deterministic computing system, you would be able to, like, functionally rewind the rat back to the point. I don't know. I keep trying to apply all these ideas in, like, a much more literal way than I think that they're actually applied. So, I mean, don't even listen to me.
I thought it was interesting that in the first scene of this episode, we see 2 of the other members of the devs team, because Stuart and Linden and Katie and Forrest are not the only people who work within this unit, but we haven't met any of the other characters. And so I do wonder if they're going to come into play or if they're just meant to be sort of background characters who get like one line here or there.
Yeah.
But
it's interesting because it makes me question the idea of like how secret this is. Cause like if it's like 4 people in my head, it's like, okay, you can keep that pretty locked down. But if it's like 15 people or whatever, like that means that like they've probably, I mean, maybe that's just confirmation that like his like Forrest and Kenton have definitely disappeared people in the past because they have all these like loose variables. I don't know.
We'll get to this too, but it definitely seems like everybody else in there is completely aware of what happened to Sergei. Like that doesn't Forrest alludes to it pretty overtly, so it seems like that's not a secret, which is up. But in this scene, we get the conversation between Stuart and Linden and Katie, where they're noting that these earthquake alarms are going off, which we're in Los Angeles. I don't think this is a thing, but maybe it's a thing specifically at Amaya, or it's a San Francisco thing, or like a near future thing. But there's these alarms going off that they think might signal an earthquake. Katie is unperturbed, and they're sort of talking around the fact that they believe that she and Forrest are breaking the rules as they were set out last episode and looking into the future, and so they know that there's not going to be an earthquake right now. And Katie is a huge smartass about it.
She is. I love this moment for Katie, like, so much, just because I feel like she's been a character throughout the, 3 episodes that we've seen. She's been kind of cold and not, like, she's not very funny, and I don't think she's supposed to be funny, but this made me laugh out loud. Like, the fact that she's, like, such a bitch about it, which it just was great. I think Alison Pill is doing, like, a fantastic job in this role. She's selling every moment.
She's so good.
She's so good.
If you're feeling anxious, I can explain it to you.
It's okay, Katie. I believe you.
There's a clip here that happens right after the fault line scene where there's some more context given in just a second. So we're going to jump over that and start talking about Lily at Jamie's apartment in what is maybe like the most awkward, like, breakup against, I don't know. Their relationship is so weird.
They're not even together.
I know. And it's
I pointed
just so
out, I think
weird.
I pointed out last week that I really want Jamie to not be the way he is.
Yeah.
To her. Like, he's so just, like, subservient and weird and just willing to do, and it, like, after pushing back against her in the first episode, at this point he's just, like, all in on her schemes and plots, and it just feels like it's not going to end well for him. And it's just, he's sleeping on the couch in his own apartment, and I get that he's like the one true gamer, like he sleeps on the couch so he never has to stop fragging, right? He cuts his own hair so he has more time to improve his KD. I get it, but like, dude, sleep in your own bed and get your ex-girlfriend who is taking advantage of you for your hacking skills to sleep on the couch. Yeah. That's what I think.
No, I agree. I think that I'm worried about Jamie a lot, and I feel like nothing good is going to come from this at all.
Chivalry.
Next, we get a really, really juicy, meaty conversation between Forrest and Katie, where they're kind of talking about, like, the entire, like, Forrest almost seems like he is starting to doubt this deterministic worldview, and it's more evidence that Katie is actually, like, the real driving personality behind this whole thing. I feel like he looks to her regarding decisions, and she seems to be the one who's, like, fully dogmatic about their worldview about the tram lines, right? He's sitting here watching this clip of Lily dying, dragging herself across the ground, and she's saying, "What are you doing? Checking whether the tram lines are still there?" And he goes, "Maybe." And it seems like that is what he's doing. So he's starting to think, what if we have changed something? And then that conversation evolves from there.
Yeah, this was my favorite. I think this is my favorite scene in the episode, like, so far. Just the idea, like, Forrest relates what they're doing. He's like, everything we're doing is predicated on the idea that we live in a physical universe, not a magical universe. And then he follows that up by saying that he's not worried that, like, magic is real. He's worried that what they're doing might make them magicians. And, like, has that conversation with Katie that we've had in the past. Like, okay, well, if you can look into the future and see exactly what's going to happen, then wouldn't you have a choice? Like, his anecdote for it is, like, what if you see that you're supposed to cross your arms and then you don't? What would happen?
You just put your hands in your pockets instead.
Exactly, which that's something that we talked about a lot even back in Watchmen with Dr. Manhattan. It's like, okay, if you know, why don't you just not do it? But Katie has no hang-ups at all on anything that's happening. She believes that the future is fixed, is exactly what she says. And that's extremely
Well, that's an interesting comparison too. Mm-hmm. It's an interesting comparison because in both cases, as the viewer, it feels like they are making a choice. It felt like Dr. Manhattan was making a choice, and it feels like Katie and Forrest, by extension, are making a choice to not change the future, and yet they're acting as if they don't have a choice. I wonder how this relates to Forrest's daughter's death. It's like when people find religion, this feels like a worldview that he is clinging to because it's providing him something. it's providing him assuredness maybe that his daughter's death wasn't his fault or something. I'm just totally stabbing in the dark here, but it feels like she is almost his like spiritual guide, and he's clinging onto this worldview because he's getting something essential out of it, and without that
makes a lot of sense, because he's literally watching Lily die and trying to convince himself that there's nothing he can do. So I mean, it would go to follow that he is also kind of simultaneously replaying his daughter's death and convincing himself that there's nothing he can do, because if something comes up and that he can save Lily now, then why couldn't he save his daughter? Right? Like, that's the next logical step.
Do you think he cares about Lily, or is it like only within the context of his daughter?
I think it's only within. I don't think he cares about Lily at all. I think it's only within the context of his daughter. But I think that the other thing that we learn in this scene is that in 48 hours, Lily is going to die. And like Katie says, it's not magic.
Yeah, that's like that is near future.
That is 2 days away that Lily is going to die. And I think that Forrest needs the reassurance that this event is absolutely going to happen, because if it doesn't, then that makes every other thing, like, that topples the dominoes in his mind, right? Like, that would mean that anything that he could have done for his daughter, he could have changed it, and he can't live with that. It's also really interesting to me that, like, they're paying attention to Lily so much, because we've been kind of proceeding through all of this assuming that Sergei was the one that they were looking at, obviously with all the, corporate espionage and whatnot. It would make a lot of sense for them to be paying a ton of attention to Sergei, right? But it now seems that they've been paying attention. Like, it doesn't seem like this is the first time that Forrest has watched this clip of Lily dying. Maybe it is. It doesn't seem, based on the conversation, that it is. So what about Lily?
Yeah, it seems like they've viewed it before, yeah.
Yeah, which, like, what's making Lily so important is my big question after all of this.
It also maybe puts the conversation from the last episode where he was saying this almost to the universe in potentially a different context. But I do feel like we still haven't fully seen whatever we are going to need to see to be able to look back at that conversation and make sense of it.
Lily and Jamie have, I guess this is a second, like, they're not together. I know that they're not together, but this is basically a second breakup. It's just... Again, so weird. I want to, like, take Jamie by the shoulders and just tell him to get some self-esteem and to do better for himself, because this is a mess.
The moment when he says,
I just remembered what it was really like going out with you,
is like kind of heartbreaking, but also very real. Like, there is that, the rose-colored glasses, like, with a past relationship where you think of that person, you only think fondly of them, you remember the good things, and then if you have to be around them again for any extended amount of time, and you just start having like the same old fights that you used to have years earlier, then you remember. And so that I love that conversation. It felt very real. After that, we get a brief conversation between Kenton and Pete. Pete wasn't in episode 3.
Pete's back. Yay,
Pete's back. Pete watched 2020 lives on. And we're still not really sure what his deal is, but he seems very self-assured. He's just very confident. He's messing with Kenton a little bit. He's not afraid of him. And it kind of makes me wonder why. Why are you not afraid of Kenton? Because Kenton is a scary person.
This conversation made me 90% sure that Pete is going to die. For sure. No. There's just no way.
Oh, no.
Like, I know. I'm so sad about it. Like, he's back, and he's like, maybe next episode he's just going to get axed.
Kenton doesn't really leave.
Hopefully not.
Kenton really doesn't leave loose ends, it seems like.
Exactly.
Bummer.
Poor Pete.
There's another brief scene after this of Linden back in the devs unit apparently discovering something, and Linden and Stuart celebrating, and it kind of made me go, oh, what the hell is going on? And then it immediately cut to something else.
Yeah, we need to talk about Lily at therapy, because this was a whole mess. It's terrifying in a totally different way. This show just keeps figuring out new ways to make me extremely anxious. And this was one of them. I was just like, oh my God, this is awful.
Do you think it was...
I mean, it made a lot of sense, right?
Do you think it was stupid of her to go with him at all? Do you think she should have put up a fight at this point? I mean, she doesn't know how much he knows, and vice versa. And so I feel like she got in the car to go to therapy because she's kind of going along with this, like, continuing to maintain the act that she's somewhat in the dark right? And that she's suffering from sort of like a schizophrenic episode, because I'm sure Kenton at this point suspects that she's been faking it, especially based on the conversation that he has with the whole point of taking her to this psychiatrist for him is to hear from the psychiatrist whether, in his professional opinion, she was faking it, which he says she was. But I don't know. I saw some people on the internet talking about this. Like, do you think this was a mistake for her to go along with this in the first place?
I don't know. I think that in her mind, I get where she's coming from. I get the idea that she is very married to the idea that she needs to, like, complete the ruse or keep it up, because it's always better if you're underestimated by the people you're going up against, right? Like, you don't ever want them to think that you are a bigger threat than you are, or whatever. But
that makes sense.
I don't know. I think that it's really scary and very, like, I also think that Kenton wasn't necessarily trying to get just, you know, the idea that, oh, she's faking or what have you, because we learn at the end of this episode that he also just kind of has this doctor in his pocket, right? Like, he just wants someone who's going to let him have, like, a legal hold over Lily, and that's, you know, it's a mess. It's just a mess. It's so scary.
We learn a little bit more about Lily in this conversation with the therapist. I do feel like, obviously, she's kind of, like, going along with something for the sake of keeping up the ruse with Kenton, but she's also being honest with this therapist. Like, she's still a little bit naive, and she believes in this concept of, like, patient doctor confidentiality, which does not apply with Amaya's, you know, in-house therapist or whatever, obviously. But so she...
Right, and she literally had just talked to Jamie about how they're, like, the mob. I don't know why she, like, still was like, oh, okay, it's fine, I can just be honest.
This feels like a counterpart to that moment in episode 2 where I thought she was being so dumb, but she was actually being smart. And here she's actually being dumb. So it's a little bit frustrating, but we learned that her dad died when she was young, and then her mother moved to Hong Kong and has a different, you know, a second family. And so that kind of puts the conversation from episode 2 where she's lying to her mom about having friends and you know, her general state in greater context, because we know that they're just not close.
Lily has no family, basically, and has no one to go to at all. It doesn't make me forgive her for what she's doing to Jamie, but
she really has nobody else. You mentioned it earlier, but the scene where Jamie cleans his apartment shirtless and then leaves and something falls off the wall, I'm not 100% sure how to interpret that.
I think he's just trying to, in his head, he's like, oh, well, you know, like, I'm gonna become a better me or whatever because I am learning to respect myself or what have you. I don't know. He definitely took the fact that Lily doesn't really want him around anymore hard. And so, you know how sometimes when, you know, like, a bad thing happens in your life, you suddenly want to, like, clean up yourself and, like, go to a gym or whatever. I think that's kind of what we're seeing in Jamie. It's just not.
Yeah,
really
it made me think of also whenever I'm leaving on a long trip, or I'm not going to be home for a while, I'll try to clean everything as much as possible. So that way when I get back, it's like almost as if he expects that he'll maybe need to run or flee, you know, if he gets too embroiled in this, maybe. Like, he just wants his stuff to be in order. I don't know, that might be just like a personal association, but it made me think of that.
Now we get into really what is the crux of the episode. We have Linden at Dev's, and we learn what that discovery he made, why he and Stuart were so happy, and it's a doozy. I know, Mike, you did some more research than I did about this, so why don't you explain what you found?
For their equations, for the code for their data, they use something called de Broglie or pilot wave theory. Pilot wave theory is this deterministic theory. Obviously, this is all Forrest and Katie's undertaking, and so this fits with their deterministic worldview. What Linden has done is replaced the mathematics of the pilot wave theory with a different theory of quantum mechanics called the Everett theory. And this is much more resembles like the multiple worlds or the multiple timelines, which, as we've learned about Forrest many times, he hates. He doesn't like it. And we learn in this episode why. And so Linden replaces the math in Forrest's code, which with the math from this other theory that goes against Forrest and Katie's worldview, and the results are incredible.
It's perfect. It works exactly as what they need. It works.
I thought it was interesting to learn that Linden's like job is concerned with sound waves. If you go back and rewatch the last few episodes, like Linden's always wearing headphones, which I thought that was just because Linden is kind of a punk. The conversation in Ep 2 between Linden and Stewart, where Stewart is saying she don't know shit about music, that's all in a new context now because Linden scoffs, and that's because his whole job is sound waves. And so for Stewart to say that Linden doesn't know anything about music is ridiculous to Linden. Of course, it's not exactly how Stewart means it, but I just thought that was some interesting new context to his character.
Yeah, for sure. And I did a little bit of research about like what the de Broglie theory actually is versus what the Everett interpretation actually is. And it sounds like, and this is me being incredibly reductive because I don't know anything about quantum mechanics aside from the few TED Talks that I've watched for this show specifically. It sounds like the de Broglie theory basically posits almost like the opposite of what we were talking about with Schrödinger. It's that every like quantum particles are like they exist even when they're not observed. Like there's no like fluctuation happening when things aren't being observed. They exist when they're unobserved, versus the Everett interpretation, which says that any quantum state that can exist is existing somewhere in the universe or in a universe.
Yeah, that's a much really better explanation than what I said.
What Linden is positing is that, like the Everett interpretation is deterministic despite what Forrest thinks, because it's not saying that cause and effect doesn't exist. It's saying that cause and effect, like all causes and all effects exist.
Yeah,
like,
it's
as
still
deterministic as you can get.
It's still deterministic. It's just allowing for variables, I think, and it's just it's like the deterministic theory, but it's just widening the tram lines to encompass everything. Now, how that allows them to zero in on audio from 2,000 years ago that previously was too garbled to make out, I don't know, but it sounds cool. Who doesn't think
it definitely does sound cool?
Who doesn't think it sounds cool? Forrest.
It's a waste of time. And it's dangerous.
I think we've all had this experience where like you're super stoked on something and think that you've done like an amazing job, even if it's just like talking to your friend and trying to be like excited and having your friend being like, oh, this is whatever. Or, like that's that moment amplified to like a million. It's in front of all of your colleagues. This is just the worst feeling in the world.
So Linden gets fired.
And it's even worse. Like, yeah, he loses his job. Ugh.
Let's talk about Linden a little bit, because Linden is just a really interesting character. Linden is clearly like 19 years old at most, right? Linden is a young kid who's clearly an unbelievable genius, and that's why he's working here. Linden is played by a female actress, Kaylee Spaney. And actually, we had Alex Garland up in the studio in San Francisco, before the world was suffering from a global pandemic, and we still had offices. And our coworker Chastity chatted with him about Linden.
I just got a sense that there would be an extreme sense of youth that I would get, just a particular sense of youth if I cast. A girl in her teens, I think Kaylee was 19 at the point we cast her, that it would just push Lyndon's age further back into a kind of indeterminate state. Yeah. So that you weren't quite
trying
sure.
To guess is like 14, 15, yeah.
Yeah, exactly, because you might see on a boy's face at a certain point like a trace of a beard starting to grow, or the sort of different physicality that boys get as they get older, and so it was to put Linden into a place where you couldn't quite reach the age and that kind of thing.
We should also talk about what Linden uncovered, which is pretty bonkers. It's the actual voice of Jesus speaking in Aramaic. which Mike, you did a little bit of research on what was actually being said.
I wanted to translate the Aramaic, and so I started by trying to phonetically transcribe what Jesus was apparently saying here, and I came up with a few words through a lot of Googling and a lot of trial and error. It seems like the word halalta is in there, which means like purification or washing. Malka is in the first sentence, and that sort of relates to abundance. And then like king or spirits of power, which also, that all seems like stuff that Jesus would be talking about.
You know, Jesus-y things.
If we assume that this audio is from the same clip that they were watching previously, it's probably from Jesus on the cross. And if you look, if you look in the Bible or whatever, for stuff that Jesus said when he was on the cross, there are a lot of quotes, but none of them really seem to fit with what I had translated from these words. There's a Redditor named Your Mom's Original who's saying that the Aramaic sounds like Arabic. Their best translation is, they say to me there's no greater self than death. They told me run and then made me famous, which that also sounds like something that Jesus would say. But the end of this rabbit hole is that I don't really have any idea. I wasn't able to like effectively translate this or find anybody who had. So, it remains a mystery. But I think it's interesting that it seems like they chose deliberately to not really go with any direct quotes from the Bible, because the Bible famously was written decades or even longer after Jesus's alleged death. And so the quotes and the various stories and the things that were supposedly said are generally, I think, depending on your beliefs, but are taken to be like parables and not necessarily exact quotes.
Right, they're secondhand, basically.
Yeah, so I think it would be really cheesy for Jesus on the cross as their I think the idea that like Jesus was a guy who lived and got crucified and like had a following 2,000 years ago is not that controversial of a thing to say. Like that's an interesting idea to me, that he was a real guy and this myth grew around him. I think it would have been really cheesy on the show's part if they had him, literally on the cross and they're watching him go, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? Or, that System of a Down lyric, Father, into thy hands I commend my spirit, which are quotes from the Bible. I think it would have been super cheeseball for them to just like have him saying those recognizable quotes. Whereas this version seems like, something that he might have actually said, but that wouldn't have necessarily been recorded. Like they're extrapolating out.
Right. It doesn't actually seem that there was some dude, standing there with like a quill pen and a piece of parchment, like taking down notes.
The one other thing that I wanted to mention from this was Forrest very directly implying that everybody knows what happened to Sergei.
This is a message to the whole team. If you didn't know it with the Russian kid, you know it now.
This show has been really good about kind of foreshadowing itself in a way that makes a ton of sense. Like, it doesn't seem like they're trying to string us along. It doesn't seem like they're throwing a ton of red herrings at us. It's just trying to kind of build its own little mysteries in really logical ways, so we've picked up before that, like, it kind of seems like the rest of the devs team is very much in on what was happening to Sergei. And this scene confirmed that for me. I mean, it's not a direct confirmation, but this is as much confirmation as I need, that everyone in devs knew what was going on with Sergei and knew what happened to him.
Yeah, because he says if it wasn't clear from what happened with the Russian kid, so he's clearly, everybody, even the named and the unnamed characters alike within devs, clearly know what the deal with Sergei was, and also what happened to him, because Forrest is also using this as a way to threaten Linden. So Linden, you're fired. You're going to get your exit package of $10 million. And if you breathe a word about this to anyone, we will kill you like we killed the Russian kid. That's the implication of this conversation.
We'll get to the big event that happens between Lily and Kenton in a second, but first I want to talk about the conversation between Forrest and Katie. It really just puts Forrest's whole worldview in context, because he literally says,
If it's not our Jesus, it's not my Amaya.
It really is the crux of it. Like, if it's not our Jesus, it's not my Amaya. It's the multiverse thing. Like, this is the problem with the mathematics that Linden has introduced into this equation, is that it might be a Jesus where one hair on his head was different, or it might be from a timeline that's so wildly divergent from ours that it's unrecognizable, and there's no way to know. And if it's the latter difference, then, you know, looking into somebody else's past is not actually valuable, because you can't prove anything that way. You know, maybe there's a timeline where there was another shooter on the grassy knoll, right? To go back to the JFK thing from a previous episode, you know, like it just doesn't, it's not useful. It's not valuable. Now we're just talking about possibilities, and they're infinite. And so we understand Forrest's position here. And yet at the same time, when she's going, yeah, well, I took Lyndon's Everett model and I applied it to the visuals, I was going, all right, Forrest is about to get f***ing owned, because he's such a smug dickhead. And it was so satisfying to just watch him go, oh no, and then just totally break down.
It's fascinating to me, because on one hand, Forrest is unbelievably selfish, right? Like, he is so single-minded in what he wants to accomplish. He's so single-minded in exactly like what his goals are, even though we're not 100% sure what his goals actually are. It's clearly all about Amaya. It's clearly all about his daughter. The fact that Linden, like, the fact that this works in my mind, and granted, again, not a quantum physicist, not a quantum computing expert, I don't know if this is true or not, but it seems like Linden is right. It seems like Linden is actually, like, he made the change and it fixed all of the problems. And instead of being like, okay, this means that we're on the right track, let's, you know, let's continue this.
Instead of being like, we can work within this, right? Let's take this model and then figure out a way to, within this model, reach our own concrete timeline. So, you know, within that, that seems like, to me, it would be the way to go. But Forrest is too arrogant.
He's too arrogant and he's too selfish. He's so selfish. It's wild. And I feel so bad for Linden. Like, I think Linden is my favorite character on the devs team, and he's so interesting to me. And the fact that he's just crushed, like, the fact that he's a 19-year-old kid getting $10 million, and his biggest concern is the fact that he's never going to get to see his friend Stuart or get to play with this really cool computer again, is just like, it's crushing.
I mean, think about if you had seen the things and done the things that Linden had done, and then somebody told you, here's like, to me and you, here's $10 million, you're free to go live your life any way you want.
You can never talk about this again.
The possibilities would be endless. I would, you know, I would do a lot of things with $10 million, but for Linden, it's like he's seen beyond the veil, right? Like, he's seen behind the curtain of reality, and now like, imagine all the things you would do with $10 million. Imagine doing that, but knowing what Linden knows. Like, I fully empathize with, like, the crushing expression and the look in his eyes when he's contemplating the idea of having to live the rest of his life, knowing that this exists and not being able to have any part in it. The last thing we'll talk about for episode 4 is the big car crash. I saw this comment on Reddit that the most unrealistic thing about this scene was the number of cars on the freeway. Lily finally starts to catch on to exactly what Kenton's plan is here. When they're in the car and he's saying, I know everything, and that she thinks he means one thing, but then it turns out he's calling her bluff, right? Effectively, because he's saying, I know that you're a danger to yourself, your schizophrenia is real, and we need to get you professional help, i.e. lock you up. And this is the moment where she has to make this choice, right? Does she continue going along with it and face the consequences of that? Or does she effectively admit that she's been bullshitting him? And obviously she chooses the latter and steers the car. This is what Jamie has been saying, which is that
exactly.
She is
this is Lily doing
reckless.
Lily exactly. Like, this is exactly what you would expect from Lily at this point. We're only 4 episodes in, but even when this was happening, I was like, oh yeah, of course, this is exactly what she would do. She's crazy.
Yeah. So she gets back to Jamie's apartment and does what she said earlier she didn't want to do, which is call the cops, and which is yet another in a string of horrible, naive decisions that she made throughout this episode. Because as she pointed out previously, think of Amaya not as a tech company, but as the mob. You wouldn't call the cops to report a crime on the mob. You would call your lawyer or someone, just somebody else who can give you protections. What she doesn't anticipate is that Kenton will use the therapist along with, maybe these detectives, because they're plainclothes. Or I think one of them is plainclothes, but that Kenton would have the cops or these detectives or whoever also would be in Amaya's pocket. And basically Lily played herself.
I don't even know if the cops are necessarily in Amaya's pocket here, because it's interesting to me that she's not actually getting arrested for anything to do with what happened at Amaya. She's getting arrested for crashing Kenton's car. Like, she's getting arrested for the fact that she willfully and intentionally caused a huge traffic accident, which then Kenton is able to use the doctor's testimony that she is dangerous, she does have schizophrenia, she's, a huge menace to society, to confirm that. But they're not necessarily, he's not making up the fact that she caused this accident and put a ton of people in danger.
Kenton really put her in a position where she had no way out. Her choices were to go along with him and go to this, psychiatric facility or wherever he was going to take her, or to make this grand, dramatic exit by crashing the car. And either way, she's boned. There's no way out of this situation now, and it really reaches its logical conclusion, which is that Kenton simply outmaneuvered her. She tried to go up against Amaya's head of security, a guy who is ruthless, who we have witnessed kill 2 separate people simply because they threatened the company that he works for. And
unfortunately, we also see
she's out of her depth.
We also see that Jamie is very much out of his depth as well. He gets
it's happening in the background behind me right now.
He gets got by Kenton, unfortunately, which means like I said earlier, that I think Pete is gonna get offed at some point in the show. I feel like Jamie is gonna meet the same fate, unfortunately.
It's interesting the way that this is shot, where it's through the doorway and you see Kenton shoving Jamie out of frame. Kenton walks alone back into the frame, closes the blinds, and then walks out of the frame once again. So what I would bet is next episode we're going to see Kenton interrogating Jamie, and then hopefully Jamie makes it out of that situation alive somehow, but I wouldn't bet on it.
I'm not going to put too much hope into that arena, but maybe.
Hello, Jamie.
That was our best attempt to break down Devs Episode 4 from the quarantine comfort of our own homes. We're doing our best. I think it went okay. We're going to be back next week talking about Episode 5, most likely in the same situation.
But until then, you can follow us on Twitter. I'm Rusty Polished, and he is Rogue Cheddar. Make sure to subscribe to GameSpot Universe for more stuff about the stuff you love, and we'll see you next week.